words are really important. And I've talked about how in the Turkish language, we don't have a word for menopause. We call it menopause. It's not a word that generally existed because it was rare for women to live long enough to outlive this organ. Women need disease-modifying, true medications, true cures for conditions that only impact them. So conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, conditions like endometriosis, together impact 30% of women on Earth. We have no drugs.
I'm Dr. Esra Çavuşoğlu, and I've been living a sober life for the past 18 years. My battle with addiction drove me to seek new methods, devices, and supplements to improve my physical and mental performance, enhance my quality of life, and ultimately live healthier for longer. From my experiences in addiction recovery, biohacking, and longevity to the latest global developments, from groundbreaking entrepreneurs to expert academics, the conversations I've had over the years are now featured weekly on Soberhead Podcast. Today at Soberhead Podcast, I'm privileged to welcome a true pioneer in the field of genomics and women's health, a fellow Turkish woman, Dr. Piraye Yurttaş Beim. As the founder and CEO of Celmatix, Dr. Beim has dedicated her career to unlocking the mysteries of reproductive health through computer technology and drugs. Under Piraye's leadership, Celmatix has become a beacon of innovation, especially in ovarian health, working on extending women's reproductive longevity and enhanced quality of life. Her work has led to remarkable advances in understanding how genetic factors influence conditions like endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome, aiming to change the landscape of women's healthcare forever with their brand new drug under its latest development stages. Let's now dive into the episode where Piraye Yurttaş Beim reveals important information about women's health. Here is something that is fascinating. A huge amount of people who watch this channel frequently are not subscribed. So I want to ask you a quick favor. When you subscribe, it helps us to make the show better, access to the world-leading experts, and ultimately bring you more value. All that I ask is for you to hit the subscribe button, and in return, I promise we will make Ayık Kafa better every day. Welcome to Soberhead Podcast, Piraye Yurttaş Beim. Normally, I don't say the full name, but you have a mixture of Turkish and American last names. It's always nice to be able to present some Turkish people who doesn't speak Turkish. I had another podcast with a dear doctor friend of mine about Alzheimer's disease, and she lived in the United States for 30 years. So we did the program in English. So you're not the first one. Piraye, when I first met you last June in New York, I was very impressed, yet I quite didn't understand what you were talking about because I couldn't wrap my mind around about this ovarian health. It's a disease. Your company, which I'm going to talk about, is working on something to help almost teenager girls to start having healthy ovaries. And I really couldn't understand until this podcast that I needed to do some research. Then I'm in another kind of a shock. Lately there's this whole longevity, ovarian health is the longevity of women. Everybody is finding longevity obviously very attractive, but I have to start with something that you said on a magazine. Menopause is seen as natural, so the therapeutic programs are focused on the symptoms of menopause. Hot flashes, for example, or delaying risk associated with menopause, like fractures that go along with osteoporosis. And then you add, so if we can reframe it as organ failure, which is what it actually is, then it elevates the therapeutic importance of extending the function of this critical endocrine process. And I had no idea what women were experiencing when they had these symptoms, such as PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or endometriosis. Obviously, women who cannot have children, that's a whole other thing. Women who are having periods every month with cramps. They may not have these diseases, but cramps. And then women who are having hot flashes, and then the rest is like horrible. I never experienced them, so I'm as guilty as men or as anyone in this world, which I am so much involved in this health arena. And when I saw a couple of documentaries about all these, my mind blows. So let's start with your story, because your story made your company, your researches, correct?
Yes. So thank you for having me on the podcast. I'll say merhaba. Biraz Türkçe konuşabiliyorum ama bugün İngilizce konuşuyoruz. I moved to the United States when I was 3, so you can imagine my Turkish proficiency. Great to be on the show. My career journey definitely has tracked my journey as a woman. 80% of women's health companies are started by women, and I don't think that's a surprise. But it is very different for overall less than 2% of venture-backed, so that means startups, venture-backed companies are founded by women. It's not because they don't want to found them, but it's very hard to access the capital. And yet a lot of women who do go into startups often focus on problems that they can relate to. And that certainly underlies my journey as well. So I have been innovating as a PhD scientist in women's health for over 20 years. I started off doing my PhD at Cornell's Medical School here in New York City, where I'm calling in from. And I did my postdoctoral research in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. For me, really the aha moment that led to the company was when I was 30. So I went from many women worry about getting pregnant too early. And then this switch gets flipped at 30 when suddenly you worry that maybe you can't get pregnant. And so I had been on the front lines of a movement in healthcare called precision medicine, where we were moving away from making diagnoses based on organs and, a couple of blood test results, and really trying to understand on a genetic level, on a level of molecules and cells, what was going on within disease. And so I had been on the front lines of that growing technology of leveraging all this data to better understand on a molecular and cellular level what disease really means. And I saw an opportunity to really try to understand what female biology meant on a molecular level. So what does it really mean to be a female cell? What does being female mean based on the molecules that are in your blood that are different than somebody else, all the way down to how your genes impact that. And so I was really passionate about precision medicine. And so I founded Celmatix in 2009. That's my company. I founded Celmatix as the first precision medicine company focused uniquely on female biology. So women's health was our unique focus. That was really the light bulb moment for me as a scientist. Was I want to move into the private sector. I really want to be making products that impact people's lives. I don't just want to be in the lab doing experiments. But when I reflect on how I even got to that light bulb moment at 30, it really traces back to my childhood. We're going to talk a little bit about a condition. You've mentioned it, endometriosis. It is estimated to impact about 15% of women on Earth, and actually has a very high prevalence rate in Turkey. There seems to be a really high percentage of women who are impacted by endometriosis in Turkey.
I was very interested to do this podcast because after I understood what it is, I spoke maybe with 10 people, and 8 of them were women. They had no idea what it was.
Interesting.
I asked a couple of other people. Then I said, yes, I'm struggling with it. The other one says, my friend as well. We don't have any cure. We're just so much in pain, and so on and so forth.
It is a big problem, including in Turkey. And most people who have endometriosis, they have it as children. So from their first period as a teenager, that's what happened with me. So I had a great childhood. I spent summers on the beach in Turkey with my grandparents. I was born in Izmir, so we were in Foça in the summers, and grew up in Texas and suburban America. It was a great childhood. And I think for me, the big foundational moment where I traced my career back to was my first period. So I had my first period. I wasn't given a lot of information about periods. It wasn't something that was talked about. So I definitely grew up in the era of stigma. Everything is stigmatized. You don't talk about it. And I had extreme pain with my first period. I had never experienced pain like that in my life. And what was truly, I think, an eye-opening moment for me that set me on this path is that no one had answers for me. No one knew why. And then I remember I spoke to my grandmother in Izmir, and I told her what was happening. And she said, "Oh, Jenem, did it happen to you too? It happens in our family sometimes. Don't worry. When you have a baby, it'll get better." And what she was really saying was we have genetic risk factors for endometriosis. And pregnancy and breastfeeding can help with the symptoms, but she didn't have that language. I didn't have that diagnosis. I didn't have tools to understand what was happening to me or to do anything about it. And so when I really kind of think about my arc as an innovator, it really dates back to that very first period I had where I thought, why is this happening? Why doesn't anybody have answers? And why can't we do anything about this? And I think most women listening to this podcast probably have that moment in their life where they've now hit, whether it's that first period or struggling to get pregnant or having a miscarriage or, dealing with menopausal symptoms. There are so many question marks in women's health. And that's something that I've dedicated my career to trying to answer those questions.
I want to stay a little bit on endometriosis because that's a scary and fascinating topic at the same time. I watched a documentary from Australia. Even when I Googled or I YouTube search, there were not many things about endometriosis. I couldn't even find anything. And then finally I found this one panel, and the young ladies, like young women, were explaining the pain such as one resembled it as apparently she has a horse, and when she got kicked once by a horse, and she said it was a similar pain. The other one had like multiple blackouts out of pain. When they went to doctor, it was like either they say like you're constipated, or they say one even had an appendicitis surgery. One doctor told to this other girl saying that you have too big a tumor on each side of your ovaries, therefore you're never going to have a child. They had no idea what was happening until, if they're lucky, one day they went to an OBGYN who had some familiarities. But yet, tell me if I'm wrong, because you're working on it, but up until today, there's no cure. And it's a continuous journey of multiple surgery, like, what do? Laparoscopy, I guess, and they clean it probably. So there's no cure, and it just keeps getting worse, it seems like.
Endometriosis is a pain condition where tissue that resembles the uterine lining, so the cells that should be inside the uterus, are growing outside of the uterus. And there's some debate in the field about where endometriosis comes from. Some people believe that there's stem cells in the peritoneum inside the pelvic cavity that turn into endometrial-like tissue in a place where it shouldn't be growing. There's also a theory that it's retrograde menstruation. So as you know, the fallopian tubes, you have kind of three holes. People don't realize you have one through your vagina, and people are familiar with that because we get our periods. But you also have two other holes through your fallopian tubes, and those open up into your pelvis, into your pelvic cavity. And so most women have, when they have their period, some of the tissue goes backwards. That's retrograde instead of down. And so for some reason, it's believed that tissue can stay and persist, and the body can't recognize it and clear it away. And so it can land on your ovaries. It can land on your bladder. It can land on your intestines. That's why there's no unified experience of endometriosis, because there's some randomness. So where that tissue is growing, if it's growing on your bladder, you're going to have bladder symptoms. You're going to have difficult urination. If it lands near your colon, you might have a condition that gets misdiagnosed as IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. If it lands on your ovaries, you could have issues with fertility and these tumors growing. So it really is, I think, complicated disease. And what we've done to treat it on a symptom level is to medicate women with painkillers. So in the United States, for example, we talked about the opioid crisis and overuse of opioids. When you hear about the opioid crisis, you think of a man working in a mine and he had an accident, and he's given opioids and becomes an addict. What doesn't get talked about is so many women end up addicted to opioids because they have no way of treating their endometriosis, and they start self-medicating. They start with marijuana. Eventually they get into fentanyl. But this is a big problem. The other way that it is treated currently is by suppressing hormones. So women are put on birth control to regulate their hormones because estrogen feeds that tissue, just like it feeds your uterine lining when it's growing in between your cycles. We also have estrogen blocking technology. So it's drugs that kind of induce a chemical menopause-like state to try to starve those lesions, those growing cells. And then there's surgery. And the problem with surgery is that that insurance often doesn't cover it in the US. It's a very complicated surgery. You're going in and, you're having to remove this tissue from these vital organs. It's not a straightforward surgery. Most surgeons are not trained in doing endometriosis surgery. Sometimes they can do more harm than good. And a lot of people, again, have it as teenagers, as children, and parents are not eager to have their children undergo radical surgeries. And so what ends up happening is that most women don't get diagnosed for up to a decade. So the average time to get diagnosed for endometriosis is about 10 years. And often that journey, like you said, is like you end up getting this diagnosis and that diagnosis. And ultimately, if you're lucky, you get to somebody who knows about endometriosis. But even the women who get the surgery, the lesions often come back. Or even when they remove all the lesions they can find, the pain persists. Because the other thing that happens with untreated endometriosis is that peripheral pain, that pain that's happening outside, kind of in your peripheral organs, it ends up creating a superhighway to your brain of pain signals. Wow. And so then when it becomes central nervous system pain, you can remove all of the sources of pain, but you still have that central highway that's sensitized. And so there are women who have undergone, they've had their uterus removed, their fallopian tubes, their ovaries, their bladder, they have everything removed, they're still in pain. It's a condition that we don't have a cure for. And as we talked about, my company, Celmatix, has just announced a drug program we've been working on in stealth, but we're now able to talk about it publicly. That will be the first, hopefully, true disease-modifying cure for endometriosis. So I'm really proud that we've gone from kind of my first experience with my painful period all the way to now, hopefully, having a real cure for this.
Because you call it an organ failure. So now let's go back to how I started. You don't call it as a reproductive organ. You call it that has a much more of an importance than just giving birth or creating children.
So you're talking about the ovary.
Yeah, ovary, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I watched a couple of videos that you were in, and you're really reactive to calling the ovaries as a reproductive organ. And can you explain why you're so reactive?
I want to say, first of all, that I was trained as a reproductive biologist, and I saw the ovary as a reproductive organ. So that's how I was trained and came up in my PhD and my postdoc. The reason that I react when people now call it a reproductive organ, even though I did that my whole career, is that when we built this precision medicine company and we invested basically $80 million in doing genetic analysis and other data work to really try to understand what was going on biologically within a female body, what we learned was how important the ovary is for so much more than just reproduction. And so when people think ovary, they usually think babies. And when they think menopause, which is when the ovary stops working, they usually think hot flashes. But what we learned and what the broader scientific community is starting to understand as well is that the ovary is important for much more than just reproduction. And there are much bigger consequences than just hot flashes. Even though hot flashes are very debilitating for women who have them, there's a lot more going on. There's actually estimated to be 300 different symptoms of menopause. It's not just hot flashes. So a lot of women who say, I don't have menopause symptoms, you say, well, do you have trouble sleeping? Yes. Do you have osteoporosis? Yes. Do you have joint pain? Yes. Do you have this? Do you have that? And then they don't associate those things with menopause. So for me, I think words are really important. And I've talked about how in the Turkish language, we don't have a word for menopause. We call it menopause. And it turns out in Hindi, in India, they don't have a word for menopause either. It's not a word that generally existed because it was rare. It was rare for women to live long enough to outlive this organ. The ovary was meant to last a lifetime. And our lifespan used to be late 30s, early 40s, as of 100 years ago. And the ovary on average stops working in your early 50s. But there's a 10-year period that now we call perimenopause, where the different functions of the ovary start to go offline. So when I say different functions, I mean the ovary is involved in immune regulation in the immune system. It's involved in the metabolic system, metabolic regulation. So a lot of women, for example, find it hard to lose weight as they get older. Yeah. They assume it's just aging. It's actually ovarian dysfunction. It's their ovary going offline. It's involved in bone health, heart health, brain health. The list is so long. And so the other side of that, and when we think about menopause or we think about early life ovarian dysfunction, like conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, which you mentioned, when the ovary isn't working even early in life before menopause. The other side of the coin is then when the ovary is not working correctly or stops working in menopause, you have a long list of issues. It is today, I know that your podcast is focused on longevity. The reason I'm so passionate about really bringing forward technology to help align ovarian lifespan with the modern lifespan, so really have the ovary function well for longer, is because today for modern women, these are women who are expected to live until their 70s or 80s, which is decades after this organ stops working. It is the single biggest accelerant of unhealthy aging. So I'm very pro-aging. I'm not anti-aging. I'm pro-healthy aging. And so I want women to not just survive, but thrive after the age of 50. And so that's why the other drug program, one of the other drug programs that we're working on at Celmatix, is a therapeutic that would extend ovarian function and optimize it in a way that aligns it with the modern lifespan.
Piraye, because you're a researcher, I'm sure, and you're focused on the genetic part of it, I guess, in this whole ovarian health. I did a previous program about menopause, and it had like 100,000 views. People were like fighting, like, oh, you should take HRT, you shouldn't take HRT, and so on and so forth. Yet, there are also people that I see, they still continue their life super healthy. Are there genetic factors that they're protective genes that, they're not as affected as that other women that is having all the negative side of the after menopause?
Again, the answer is complicated. So when we look at genetic determination for anything, whether it's healthy aging, cancer risk, heart disease risk, anything, when you look at the risk factor, so let's say in this direction, up and down, for anybody watching the video, but if you're just listening, up and down. So this is like high risk, right? And then this is the prevalence in society. So it's shaped kind of like this, which means that we have it's shaped kind of like a mountain where you have a high peak, like a ski slope. And so what you have under the peak part of that curve is very few people who have a very high genetic determinant. That could be a positive genetic determinant, that could be a negative. So that means like a handful of people, let's say less than 5% of people have a genetic risk factor that says that they are very likely to get Alzheimer's or they are very likely to get cancer. Or on the positive side, they are very likely to age well, no matter what they do to their bodies, right? These are like the French woman who lived to 120 and they asked her why. And she said, I eat a pound of chocolate a day,
and
right?
Smoke.
So like, and I smoke, right? So like those people have like that positive genetic factor that, do what you want to your body, you're going to survive and you're going to be healthy. Then there's the 95%. And the 95% is this sloping curve of varying genetic impacts. But then you start to get into the impact of environment, right? And then now if you think of it as a triangle, right? If you take a square and you cut a triangle, the bottom half triangle of that square, if you cut it diagonally, is the genetic determinants of an outcome, right? So again, very few people have a very high genetic determinant. Most people have low genetic determinants. On the other side of the other triangle on the top, you have environmental factors, right? So if you're in ground zero of the Chernobyl accident, you're probably going to get cancer, no matter what your genetics are, because you've got such a huge environmental exposure. But for most people who are exposed to cigarette smoke or gas from, car exhaust or something, it'll be a mix of their genetics and their environment. The reason this is important is that we don't have any control over our genetics. And most people don't know what their genetics are. You have a little bit of a hint by looking at your family. If you have biological relatives and you know what their lifespan was. So if you have parents who lived till their 90s and were healthy, you have a really good shot of doing that as well. But you can take all of that great genetics that mom and dad gave you and you can wreck it with environment, right? So those are lifestyle factors. Those are decisions. And what we know is that exercise is the best technology we've ever found or invented to age in a healthy way. So most people who age in a healthy way, it's because they are making those small decisions every day. They are sleeping well, they're eating well, they're exercising, they are managing their stress, and they are linked into communities and they have loved ones and they are not lonely. So those are really the pillars of aging well. And then there's like less than 5% of people who just won the lottery genetically. And again, they can smoke and they can, be by themselves and in a bad mood all the time and not exercise, and they're still going to live till 100 and be healthy. But that's like a very, very small percentage of people. And it's the same thing with ovarian. risk as well. So there are less than 5% of women that are just genetically wired to go into early menopause and to have dysfunction in their ovaries. Most women, the lifespan of their ovary is kind of average lifespan, and they can detract a few years by environment. So they can take away from their ovarian health by things like smoking. Yes, it is genetically determined, but it's a mix of genetics and lifestyle.
Let me ask you this. So you have a couple of programs at Celmatix. One is for the reproductive, correct?
Yeah, so infertility. Yeah,
infertility. You're still there. You're doing that.
We acknowledge it. It does exist. It's an important area.
What are the areas that you guys are focusing?
We've got 4 drug programs. So we've got 2 drug programs that are focused on infertility treatment and trying to create better infertility treatment. So I'll take a step back and say that we have 3 pillars at the company. One is that modern women, so these are women who are expected to live well into their 70s and 80s. Modern women are missing 3 things to really thrive. So one is we need all of our organs, including our ovaries, to function well throughout our lifespan. And so that is one program. That is our ovarian aging program, which will impact conditions like PCOS as well, but is primarily right now focused on trying to extend ovarian function so that we can eliminate perimenopause, we can eliminate menopausal symptoms, et cetera, and allow women to age in a healthier way. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is women who are not just surviving, but thriving well into their 70s and 80s, don't want to have all of their babies between the age of 18 and 35 or 40. They want to extend their window. And when they rely on fertility treatments to extend their window to have babies, we need to make that a better experience. Right now, many women, about 20% of women, cannot benefit from IVF. No matter how much money they have and desire they have, they are not going to benefit from that because they are not making enough follicles to respond to the fertility drug. So one of our infertility drugs is focused on helping women pull more follicles out of storage in their ovaries month over month so that they can respond better to fertility treatment. So that's one, is expanding access to fertility care, making it better.
Would you like to tell to the audience what's the lifespan of the ovaries from being in the womb of a mother to 35? Because that's very linked.
Yes, they are linked. So to understand the drug programs, I think it is important to understand that. So during fetal development, so when you are in your mother, around week 14, you have millions of these cell clusters that have a future egg cell inside of them and then a future follicle wrapped around the egg cell. So that's like thousands of cells that are wrapped around the egg. What happens in week 14 of pregnancy is that you eliminate many of those. So there's kind of a quality control going on and, you lose a lot of follicles. Some women don't realize is what they expose their bodies to around week 14 of pregnancy is impacting their daughter's age of menopause.
Wow.
It's impacting their daughter's fertility. Right. So that's like, that's like mind blowing that like all the choices you're making as an adult, you're eating well, you're exercising, you're managing your stress, but your infertility may actually date all the way back to when you were 14 weeks old in the womb. And there's nothing you can do based on kind of what happened to you then. So, so there's a lot that goes into this, right? So the ovary is very sensitive around that time. And so it's getting loaded with the pre-follicles. At birth, we have a wide range, again, because of a mix of genetics, but also those environmental exposures in the womb. We have a wide range. Some women are born with 3 million pre-follicles. Some women are born with 10,000, right? So if you're born with 10,000 on day one, you don't have as many to use throughout your lifespan. If you're born with 3 million, you may have too many. You might actually end up with PCOS and you might end up with an ovary that's overloaded. So on average, women have between like 500,000 and 1 million follicles, cells that can turn into follicles at birth. The follicle is a functional unit. So the follicle, a lot of people have heard of hair follicles, right? So it's like the cells that grow the hair. We also have follicles in our ovaries that grow the egg and do all of the functions of the ovary. So the ovary stays very quiet through childhood. And then at puberty, it gets turned on and it starts to pull those follicles out of storage and activate them to make an egg. And so day over day, each woman activates a different number. And what the ovary is trying to do is trying to get to the perfect egg at the end of that activation cycle. And so many women have heard of the menstrual cycle. So it's about a 28-day cycle. The menstrual cycle is actually the last 28 days of the folliculogenesis cycle. The folliculogenesis cycle, which most people haven't heard of, is a 300-day process starting with the activation of a follicle, the growth, stop, growth, stop, growth, stop. And then finally, it either dies because the ovary determines you are not the best follicle we have in this cohort of follicles, or you are the lead follicle, grow, grow, grow. And then it enters the menstrual cycle and turns into the egg that gets ovulated. And so as we are pulling follicles into this folliculogenesis, we're also depleting our ovarian function over time. And so when you get to a place where you have less than, a few thousand follicles in your ovary, it throws off the dynamics of the ovary and your ovary stops working. And so that's a process, though. It kind of winds down. For men, this happens too. So the ovary is a gonad, and men have gonads too. We call them testes in English. And testicular function for men peaks in their teens, around 16, and then declines in a line, like linearly, slowly over their lifespan. And if we live to 150, men would experience the end of testicular function as well. But the testes work for about 100 years, and we don't live much past 100 years. And so most men don't experience the kinds of issues that we experience because their body has time to adjust to their changing hormones. Our bodies are different. So the ovary, as it starts to wind down, it actually goes into a period of accelerated decline because the egg quality is getting worse and it's having to pull more and more out of storage day over day. And so it kind of burns out towards the end. And the slope of that curve, how quickly you fall off that curve, which is environmentally determined and genetically determined, helps explain why some women have very bad menopausal symptoms and a very difficult time with perimenopause. And some women coast into it and kind of don't realize that they're going through it as much. One of the things that we're working on in our infertility drug program is, so our ovarian aging program, which I talked about first, is meant to regulate that process, to slow it down and make it a smooth line, just like men experience, so that your ovary ages, but it ages slowly and gently, and we can extend it hopefully throughout your lifespan, but certainly for at least another 10 to 15 years. The other side of that coin is to speed that process up. So if we pull more out, then we have more to use for IVF as well. So women right now, they go in and they get told, oh, you have 1 or 2 follicles, you're going to make maybe 1 egg. They are not a great candidate for IVF. What we want to do is preload the ovary with, 10 to 20 follicles just for a few cycles, and then stimulate with fertility drugs. So that's what one of our drug programs is focused on. And then the other thing is that women who go through fertility treatments have to do a lot of injections. And whenever you talk to anyone who's done egg freezing or IVF, that's the number one thing they remember is, oh my God, I had to inject myself so much. We don't have to do that anymore. So we are developing a drug that is a pill. It's an oral drug that instead of injecting yourself with the hormone, which is huge, and that's why you have to put it in a needle and put it straight into your bloodstream, we have a very small molecule. So it's like the difference between injecting yourself with a molecule the size of a house versus something the size of like a bathtub. So when you can regulate that receptor with a bathtub, it's a safer drug. It's a drug you can take orally. It'll have better side effects. And so that's the third program we're working on, is an oral FSH. So that second pillar I talked about is women need better fertility treatments so that they can have babies for longer. And then the third pillar that we're focused on is women need disease-modifying true medications, true cures for conditions that only impact them. So conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, conditions like endometriosis, together impact 30% of women on Earth. We have no drugs, no real treatments. We just manage symptoms. And women need to be able to manage these diseases because they don't just give them a hard time early in their life. They set them up for unhealthy aging. So if you have PCOS and it goes untreated, you are at risk for metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity, mental health issues, cardiovascular disease, a number of issues, right? If you have endometriosis and it goes untreated through your lifespan, not only do you have risk factors for infertility, but you're at heightened risk for ovarian cancer. You're at heightened risk for mental health issues. You have a heightened risk for autoimmune disease. There's a number of heart disease. There's a number of issues that start to accumulate. So when women are having painful periods as teenagers, and we just give them a painkiller and tell them to get back to school or, to sleep it off, what we don't realize is that's hurting their heart. That painful period is starting to hurt their heart. And that's going to translate into an early heart attack in their 60s. Wow. We don't think about that these pain conditions or, issues that they're having as teenagers are telling us something about how their body is going to age in a couple of decades. And so for us, those are the 3 pillars at Celmatix: is healthy organs, including the ovary throughout the lifespan, better fertility treatments, and truly disease-altering medications for conditions that uniquely impact women so that we can get their physiology into balance and allow them to age in a healthy way in future years as well.
Where are these works at? Is it at the trials or did it pass the trial phase?
So they're all in the laboratory right now. So we are in what we call preclinical. So we are not yet approved to go into humans. We're still testing in animals. So we're hoping to have our first drug in humans in about 2 years.
That's very close. It's amazing. You know, I'm going to go back to our walk on West Side Highway. You were explaining all these and you were saying all these like, oh, we're planning to give shots to teenager girls every month. And I'm like, you know, I feel like this is a very strong approach. Then when I saw these diseases, I said, this is like beautiful. That's great. So what are you envisioning?
One of the questions I get a lot about our ovarian aging program is, wait, so you're going to make me have painful periods and PMS and all of these issues for my whole life? Why? Leave me alone. You know, let me go into menopause. What I try to say to people is like, no, I'm not saying let's take the poor quality of health that you're used to early in life with painful periods or, you know, the symptoms of PCOS, which is unwanted weight gain, hair in places you don't want it, you know, issues with mood regulation. I'm not saying let's take that bad experience of women's health and force you to have it for decades more. That's not what I'm saying. My vision is that we can actually work in harmony with the female body by understanding it better and developing purpose-built medications for the female body. We can make women healthier from a younger age, starting when they're teenagers and in their early 20s. And so they don't dread their period. They aren't struggling with weight gain and mood swings. They aren't struggling with PMS and pain. So we want to give them a better experience early in life so that they actually want their female biology to continue throughout their lifespan. Because, you know, we have this joke that men age like a fine wine, you know, and women don't, right? Like we shrivel up or whatever in midlife. I want women to have, you know, the same vitality of their healthy earlier years. I want women running, you know, triathlons in their 60s and 70s. I want them sleeping well. I want them to have a great sex drive. I want them to, you know, have clear thinking and not have brain fog and not have aching joints, rebound from exercise the way they could, enjoy a glass of wine. I mean, so many women, once they get past 40, cannot have a glass of wine without feeling destroyed the next day versus when they were younger. So we really, to me, fundamentally, this is about playing catch up. So last century, we discovered antibiotics, we progressed surgical methods, we invented vaccines, and that gave us decades more. We doubled the human lifespan. But what we didn't address is quality of life. And so I see the opportunity in this century addressing quality of life. Let's take all those extra decades, which right now are so full of disease, right? We got all these extra decades. We're not dying of, you know, scarlet fever anymore or measles, but now we die a slow, painful death of these chronic illnesses that we have for decades. And I don't think we have to. And what I want to say, the reason I'm focused on women, because I have 2 boys. I have a daughter and I have 2 sons. And sometimes my boys say like, well, don't you care about boys or men? You know, and it's not that I don't. It's not that I don't. But the reality is that even though we have this this myth, let's call it is a reality, but, you know, that women outlive men. And so people often say, well, why are you focused on female longevity? Women outlive men already. Yeah, statistically speaking, we outlive men by a few years. However, we are sick for 25% more of our lifespan than men. And so what are we getting for those few years? We're in a nursing home. We can't control our bladders because our pelvic floor is destroyed because we lost all of our estrogen and, you know, all those tissues have been degraded. We have Alzheimer's. 2/3 of all people with Alzheimer's are female. We are not thriving for those extra years that we are surviving. And so that's really important to me, is to focus on women, because women are carrying the disproportionate burden of disease, which is not fair. But also, women are a pillar of healthcare. So we make up the majority of healthcare providers in the home and out of the home. When we have a sick family member, it often falls on a woman to care for that family member. If she's not healthy, she can't help anyone. So I think by helping women and creating equality for women and how they age compared to men, we hear these stories of, you know, oh, this man was running down the street at 65, dropped dead. Right? Yeah. But like, how nice to die like a man, to be healthy until the moment that you die.
You're absolutely right.
Right? No one wants to die like a woman. slowly, osteoporosis, breaking, Alzheimer's. So I think we want to create that equality to, live well and then drop dead. I think that is like the dream for women. So that's something that I'm very focused on. But if we really want that, we have to start again in youth, in the teenage years, because it's the things that are happening in the body when the ovary starts to turn on that are setting up your story for how you're going to age in your 50s, 60s, 70s. We have to start from a young age. So that's why we're focused on really addressing health across the lifespan for women.
Piraye, so based on what you say, I'm going to be kind of talking around the menopause that you don't really like that word. Hormone replacement therapy can never take the place of what ovaries are producing.
That's right.
That's what I'm understanding. So that's
right.
Like a Band-Aid-ish a bit.
It's a Band-Aid. Yeah. So estrogen, first of all, is a misnomer. There's an estrogen. There's estrogens. Mm-hmm. So we have many different estrogens. We have at least 6, probably more if we studied it better. And these estrogens impact us in different ways. You have a different estrogen in your body when you're pregnant versus, when you're not pregnant. So when we add estrogen, quote unquote estrogen, back in hormone replacement therapy, first of all, often it is not our own estrogen or estrogens, right? But the other thing is it's not dynamic. So it's not that we have the single dose of estrogen all the time. Not only do we have estrogens, multiple estrogens that are produced and have slightly different functions, but the levels go up and down of these different estrogens. So the analogy that I like to make is a symphony. So you have the symphony, you have different notes, they go up and down. It's this beautiful sound. Hormone replacement therapy is like replacing a symphony with a foghorn. It's just this one, so you have this one estrogen, it's around all the time. The levels don't go up or down. So that's one, ditto for progesterone and testosterone, which we can also replace with hormone replacement therapy. But even if we could beautifully replicate that symphony of estrogens going up and down and progesterones going up and down and testosterones going up and down, that's the tip of the iceberg of what the ovary is producing. It's producing insulin growth factor. It's producing anti-Mullerian hormone. It's producing a number of other things. And it's also responding to things like melatonin is one of the things we talked about, the sleep hormone that people think about. You cannot make ovarian hormones without melatonin. It speaks to the ovary. It impacts the level of all of these things. So when you take this vital organ that is working in harmony with all of the cells in your body from literally the day you are conceived and develop organs, you take it out of the mix, you just lost so much signal, right? And then when you replace it with this foghorn patch or, pill that you're taking, it helps with some things, to have one of those notes back. But you cannot recapitulate that symphony. And that's why we start to accumulate disease.
So your estimation is within the couple of years, all these programs are going to be up and running?
I think in a few years, we're going to do a couple of things. One, I think we're going to be able to extend ovarian function so that we have our natural ovarian function, our natural ovarian hormones for longer. That's the most
poor
important.
us.
The best is
we missed that boat.
I know
newcomers.
The newcomers. I get asked, is this going to help me? And I ask people, well, how old are you? So I think if you're currently probably in your early 30s, you will benefit from this. If you are in your mid to late 30s or beyond, you're not going to. But I think for the rest of us, including myself, what we can also do is by better understanding all of these beautiful factors and by creating better protocols for HRT. HRT, we could do better with HRT. We could have better estrogens. We could have better replacement. I think what we're going to do when we see the benefit that having an ovary function for longer for the women who are young enough to benefit from that, there's going to be all the rest of us who are going to say, well, what about us?
Exactly.
And I think a lot of innovation is going to happen in the coming years to do better for us as well and to have a more sophisticated approach to HRT than we have right now, because HRT right now is very unsophisticated, and it's not surprising because it's been around for almost 100 years. This is not like an advanced technology. It's been around for a long time. We can do better for HRT as well, and that's something that I'm also passionate about. I'm just not focused on that right now because we've got a lot. We're a small company. We're already trying to cover all 3 pillars, but I do think that companies that are focused on HRT need to do a better job of optimizing HRT and personalizing it for women because it's not a one-size-fits-all.
I think so too. With all these wonderful things that you said, now I'm like, I had to stay in my 30s and not come to 53 since I'm trying to be so healthy now that I don't have a healthy ovaries, obviously, because I'm in my post-menopause. But I'm so happy that the newcomers, the young generation, are going to be able to benefit, because at least you, me, people around our age, we had a time in the world when we were living that there were not many toxic load in our system. There were no cell phones, the pollution was not this bad, the quality of food was not this bad. So now they are so bombarded with it, so that, they're not going to be even as healthy as us, probably.
Yeah, life expectancy has gone down for the younger generation. Right now in America, my children are not expected to live as long as me because of those factors, including diet. Children in America eat a bathtub of sugar, of added sugar, a year. So there's a lot, you're right, that we handed to this generation that wasn't fair, that we weren't exposed to when we were younger. But hopefully we can also give them some awareness so they can fix that, but also some technology to have things that we didn't have access to.
Piraye, thank you so much. I think this program is going to have a lot of success among the audience, because no one talks about women problems. No one talks about menopause. No one talks about these things as a disease. No one talks about that. Most research studies were done to men and not to women, and we're taking men research medications.
Yeah.
Thank you for front runner of all these research coming to the program, even though we had a bit of a difficulty. So we're going to add to the show notes your company. So where people can find you, I'm going to say, but you're not findable, but still say the name of the company again.
So the company is Celmatix. They can go to CELMATIX.com or follow us on LinkedIn. We try to keep everybody updated on LinkedIn. And people can also follow me on Instagram. So I have an Instagram. It's boss_ovary.
Okay, that's great.
So people can follow me on Boss Ovary. And I try to share a little bit about our journey as we develop these innovations, but also share tips for ovarian health as well.
It's now time for you to share all these wonderful things, because you were keeping it so silent for such a long time. But now you're at the tail end of this journey. Thank you so much for making time for me. And hopefully I'll come back to New York in a couple of weeks. Maybe you'll be around there.
That would be great. Wonderful. Thank you for having me.